Hello, welcome to a little recap of Luke 19 and 20. We have a small group that meets at Rolls-Holman on Fridays at noon. We started in the fall quarter and we do 2 chapters a week. We went through all of Luke 1 through Luke 18, and then today is Luke 19 and 20. I did not record any videos for the whole of the fall because I had a class after. But this winter I'm available, so I thought maybe I'd start it back up and maybe get in the tradition of recording these little videos. To be honest, they're largely to remind me of some of the fun things that we learned together, but also I put them on YouTube so that other people could see what our Bible study looks like as well. So diving back in to the slides, every week we kind of recap where we're at. Being at Luke 19, we're already pretty far into the story. Here's the Bible Project poster over Luke, the overview. And where we're at with chapter 19 is a pivotal moment. So we're moving from the journey and then we're arriving at Jerusalem. So we're kind of finished with phase one, finished with phase two, and then here we're starting the third and final panel. And 19 is a really nice one because it actually kind of gives us the culminating story of the journey. That's Zacchaeus, and we'll kind of see why we call it the culminating story. And then also the first story, which is actually the parable of the 10 minas of this next frame, and then the triumphal entry, and then the cleansing of the temple. And so we'll talk about those, and then we'll also talk some about chapter 20 stories. Every time in these small group meetings, I start with a quote of the day. I just kind of grab something from the passage. It's usually something that captures, some bigger themes that are going on here, but also something that we may not get a focus on otherwise. So it's kind of like a niche thing that we just kind of raise up to the top surface. This one is from the special Luke materials. This is Luke's only material that's at the end of the triumphal entry. So after the triumphal entry, kind of like the traditional part that's in all four gospel accounts, happens in Luke only. The Pharisees tell him to shut his disciples up, right? And so they're obviously thinking that we're going to get ourselves in trouble with the Romans. You can't come in here and claim to be a king. And so their idea of keeping themselves safe is to get Jesus to tell his disciples to shut it, right? And so that's where we start. So Jesus' answer is, I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out. The stones is a reference to much earlier in Luke chapter 3, where it talks about John the Baptist. God could raise up children for Abraham out of these stones, right? So it's kind of a connection to way back. But more importantly, here it's being used to show the inevitability, right? So there is nothing that is going to stop the world that God has made rejoicing when the king returns. And so not going to happen. And then I'll just kind of keep reading to the point here. When he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and he wept over it. One of two places where Jesus weeps. So right here, Jesus is weeping in only the Gospel of Luke over Jerusalem. There's one other, if you happen to think of it, a very popular Bible verse, only 2 words. Jesus wept. It's over in John over the death of Lazarus. So he wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace. So I highlighted the words even you, just to kind of emphasize that Jerusalem has a long history of poor choices, right? I mean, from the Samuel King's time frame all the way through their history. But even you, kind of like the lost sheep, right, could actually turn it around if you knew the things that make for peace. So their strategy for peace was to not celebrate God's visitation to Jerusalem, but that is not what's going to bring peace. If they had known what would bring them peace, their fate could have been avoided. But we'll go ahead and read the aftermath, what is going to happen. But now they have been hidden from your eyes. They couldn't even see what they should be doing. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side. All these things happen in AD 70, by the way. And they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. So if they could have recognized who Jesus was, they could have made a change in their life and lived according to the kingdom. The fate that Jerusalem would face could have been avoided. So it's just kind of a neat thing that even you, it's not too late for. So it's kind of a fun quote that's got some special L in the middle of the triumphal entry. So that's kind of fun. What is the big picture of Luke 19 and Luke 20? So Luke 19 starts with the story of Zacchaeus, which is where we'll kick things off when we get going today. A special Luke story. The parable of the 10 minas, also a special Luke story. That kind of parallels, that's the arrival of the king. So the king goes off and then he comes back, right? That's got a parallel parable in 20. That's one advantage of how we do 2 chapters at a time. Sometimes you can see the pair story. Luke very regularly, he's an upward spiraling staircase that has pair stories all the time. And so this one connects with this one, which is somebody made a wine press, a vineyard, and then he sent servants to collect from it, including his son. And they kind of go together. By the way, this is just kind of a small weird thing in English. Parable of the 10 minas, parable of the 10 ants. All right. Obviously, it's not 10 ants; it's the tenants. But it is funny that the conclusion of that parable is the stone the builder rejected has fallen on them and crushed them. Right, which is like ants. So anyway, weird little things there. I like infographics. I like to view these not just with words but with pictures. The way I'd show it with pictures kind of looks like this. So there's the story of Zacchaeus, which very much points back to the journey. It's extremely well written to where you wouldn't even notice that Luke has done this. But there's many themes, I mean, at least 5 pointing backwards and 2 pointing forwards that connect this story and tie together the 2 frames of the journey and then the move into Jerusalem. It's so well done that you don't notice, but when you start seeing it, you'll really see it. And then we move into the king returns phase, his welcome, and then also goes into his house. So we see some things with Zacchaeus welcoming him to his house, but Jerusalem, of course, does not. Comment about who gave you authority to do this. Even John includes that. And then the other parable about the tenants. And then chapter 20, we ran out of time for this in our small group, but maybe I'll say a couple things in the video. There's some scripture kung fu, I guess I might call it, paying taxes, marriage, and existing before David. So some really interesting things in 20, which we did not have time for in our meeting, but maybe I'll mention here. Always like to talk about pericope is what people call them. A pericope is a Greek word. It means a cutting of the text. So you can look at these stories and see what's similar amongst different gospels. And each 3 verses or so, usually around that forms a pericope. Sometimes it can be many. And you can compare them from one to the other. So here are the 6 pericope of Luke chapter 19. The 2 that are the big ones that are in all 4 Gospels are the triumphal entry and the temple, of course. The 2 that are special L, there's Zacchaeus is special L. Oh, I forgot. Matthew has a parable of the 10 minas. I'd forgotten about that one. And then there's the special L, weeping over Jerusalem. By the way, that was the quote of the day one. I did just want to mention that all the Gospels predict the destruction of the temple. It's just that Luke does it twice. He does it here and there, but everybody is going to do it. So don't think that prediction is special L. Just the phrase that's in the triumphal entry is special L. That's going to be 19. 20, you can see we are in full lockstep mode, right? So these things are in all the synoptics. We have an activity later where we set them all down on the floor or the table and look at the 3 synoptics and John, and you can see pretty clearly why they're called the synoptics and John is a little bit separate. Some extremely good stories in here, told in slightly different ways with little variations amongst the gospel. We're going to kind of compare and contrast some of them. By the way, in John, by the time the triumphal entry does occur, we're kind of past talking in John. The triumphal entry happens in chapter 12, so like halfway into the gospel, right? And there's a lot at the Last Supper in John, which is awesome. But even by the time the triumphal entry happens, there's no teaching in the temple courts. He's done that in the previous years. The Gospels are just very different. So I'll give a little background here. In Mark, and then Matthew follows suit and Luke follows suit. Jesus only does one trip to Jerusalem, which is kind of awkward, right? He's just like this one massive trip to Jerusalem, which is not quite historical, right? So Jesus was a Jew. He would have gone there 3 times a year during his ministry, which we consider to be 3 years because of how John is written. I mean, he probably made a dozen trips, right? And so, I mean, maybe not that many, but the point being, it was not just one big triumphal journey. It's told in Mark. Mark started this thing as one journey to make the story simpler and easier to understand. And so as a result, these things had to happen after the triumphal entry. But in John, stories like this would have happened months, years earlier, right? These like medium hostility things. And so just kind of interesting that they happen in the Synoptics, but not in John. I actually don't know which is historical because, to be honest, the way they're told in the Synoptics makes a lot of sense too. Jesus had, 1,000 people plus listening to him, and so they couldn't lay a hand on him, which is why they got him at night, right? So it's just kind of interesting. All right, I talked about that too long. Here's the one I wanted to mention just because I think it's fun. I highlighted paying tribute to Caesar. This is a story where they ask him if it's right to pay taxes to Caesar or not. He famously answers, "Show me a denarius, whose inscription and portrait is on it." I decided to highlight this one just because I think it's cool. That we have this coin, right? We have a denarius. I don't know how many there are in the world, but some museum has a picture of it, which is crazy because, we think about, if we said somebody was holding a penny, you can visualize what a penny looks like and you can know what they looked like holding it. It's unclear, depending on which gospel, whether Jesus was holding it, like they threw it to him and he caught it type of thing, or if he simply was shown it, right? But he says whose inscription and portrait are on it, maybe reverse order of that. The portrait was Tiberius Caesar. He was the current Caesar in AD, big range, but around AD 30 to 33 time frame for sure. And so that was his portrait on the front. And then on the back would have been the high office of Pontifex Maximus. That's kind of like the high priest of the Roman Church. This office was currently held at this time by Augustus. He was still alive. He was the previous Caesar, and he would have actually been the Pontifex Maximus. Much like the pharaohs in Egypt, who claimed to be gods, Rome was very much going that direction, right? And so the previous Caesar was almost always called a god, going back to Julius Caesar time frame, right? And then the next Caesar would claim to be the son of God, right? And so they use this term in this language, that he was called the Lord, the master, right? So lots of interesting things about how the Bible comes out of this context and the language comes out of this context. But at any rate, the front of the coin would said Tiberius Caesar Augustus, so would have taken the name of Augustus as his final name, son of divine Augustus, right? So who was a god. And then the back would be the high priest, kind of like the Jewish nation has a high priest. The Romans had a high priest, the Pontifex Maximus, and Tiberius would have taken that title too. So at any rate, just fun to visualize Jesus holding or looking at this specific coin when he gave this teaching. All right, so let's start going through it. We'll start off with Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a story which comes on the heels of blind Bartimaeus. So blind Bartimaeus was the end of chapter 18. Just to kind of remind you of the last thing we read, you remember the end of chapter 18, right? It was Jesus healing a blind man in Jericho. Interesting, these are just kind of funny little things. In Matthew and Mark, Bartimaeus, he's only named in Mark. Bartimaeus is healed after they left Jericho, like they've left Jericho and they're heading this way. And then in Matthew and Mark, the next story is the triumphal entry, right? So there's no gaps between. It's healing this. There's differences between each of the Gospels here. John doesn't tell the story at all, but Mark names him Bartimaeus, right? Which is neat. So Mark did this a couple times in his gospel. If he thought you might knew somebody, he would say their name. And so the guy's name was Bartimaeus. Maybe you've seen him, right? Because you have gone along this road from Jericho to Jerusalem. He did it again later when I think it was Simon from Cyrene was carrying the cross. And then like Mark just adds, his son's Rufus, and somebody else, I forgot the name. It's funny how personal Mark is in telling stories. At any rate, Matthew also was leaving. In Matthew, there were actually two blind men, which is fine. This one, Bartimaeus, got spotlighted, but there were actually two people there. Luke gets based on Mark, but he leaves out the name. But at any rate, one funny change in Luke is he's suddenly approaching Jericho, so it happens in a physically different location. Things like this, our time era considers scandalous, right? So we've got an error in the Bible. Well, which was it? Was it leaving or was it approaching? And so I always joke about meeting Luke, later, and asking him, Luke, did you cheat? Did you just change it for literary reasons, right? Because to me, in my world, like, you can't do that, right? Like, it makes a lie in the Bible, and I just imagine Luke is kind of saying, it's like, that sounds like a you problem, Dave. So for literary reasons, they were allowed to do little moves like that, no problem at all. But to Luke, it was important, for probably literary reasons, that the next story, Zacchaeus, be the conclusion story. So let's talk about this Zacchaeus story. We'll set it up a little bit. Zacchaeus, famous story largely because the story reads, and we've interpreted it as being, Zacchaeus was short and climbed a tree. Interestingly, they were all short, right? So a Jewish man in the first century, they would have ranged in height from 5'1" to 5'5". Jesus, not different from anybody else, would have been in that height range as well. Let's say he was 5'3", right? Jesus would have come up to my shoulders, right? I mean, I'm 6'1", and he probably would have weighed like 130 to 140 pounds. By the way, also, if you read the story carefully, it says because he was a short man, and the he, by the way, most everyone assumes the he is Zacchaeus, but the he, by the way, could have been Jesus, right? It could have been that Jesus was short, but at any rate, it's just kind of a funny little thing. So if Zacchaeus was even short for normal at the time, he was probably like 4'6", right? Like, probably a short dude who fit up to my armpit. By the way, it's funny in the popular TV show now is The Chosen, right? I mean, Jesus is played by a 6'2" guy who's like built and muscular, right? That's not a picture of Jesus, right? Jesus was a shorty, right? So then there's no way they could do that in The Chosen, but he was a little guy, which is kind of funny. Nothing amazing about his physical appearance. By the way, other people that are 5'3", just kind of as a joke, the shortest NBA player ever was 5'3", Muggsy Bogues. And so he was Muggsy Bogues. He played with Manute Bol, which is kind of funny. Quite a big height difference in them. It makes me think of Zacchaeus. Other things just to mention about Zacchaeus, I won't harp on this one, but Zacchaeus is a tax collector, a chief tax collector, and it's interesting how many times tax collectors come up. We don't really think about this much, but in Mark, tax collectors only come up one time, and it's when the calling of Matthew happens. It's the only time tax collectors are ever mentioned, right? Admittedly, he says it 3 times, but it's just right in these 2 verses. And that's because tax collectors were a hated position, but there were a lot of people in that time frame that probably had jobs that were kind of viewed as like betrayal jobs, right? Sell out to the Romans. But there were so many people that had to make them food, that had to build houses, that had to make pots and pans and bowls, that had to make their swords, that had to make their cloaks. Lydia made cloaks for Romans, right? And there were a lot of people, more than just tax collectors, that were hated. They were probably the most hated, right? But Mark mentions just tax collectors here. He mentions other people like guards that were hated, things like that, but nothing special about tax collectors. It's only Matthew, who was a tax collector, where we really start seeing an increase in the number of tax collector stories. So Matthew mentions tax collectors 8 times, so four times as many verses, right? He notices them mainly when Jesus is talking. So you can see that 5 of them are spoken by Jesus. And you can think of this as like, Matthew is there, and Jesus looks in Matthew's eyes. They kind of like exchange a glance, and he says something about tax collectors, right? And Matthew remembers when these things happen, and he writes them down, right? And so it's not surprising that Matthew would have remembered more of them, being a tax collector. I'm sure that Jesus said them, but it's just kind of funny that you get a lot more tax collectors in Matthew. Then the next question that I think is fun is, what about Luke? If Luke was only based on Mark and this non-generic Q source, you would probably expect that Luke mentions tax collectors like maybe 3 or 4 times. He's longer, so a few more than Mark. But if Luke was somehow based on the human being Matthew, who was a tax collector, then you would expect to see a lot of mentions of tax collectors. So which is it? And it's very much the latter, right? So Luke mentions tax collectors the most, 10 times he says the word tax collector. And then Zacchaeus here is number 11, the chief tax collector. So you can see the Greek word for tax collector there, and then the addition of the chief part for the tax collector. So I would say it's pretty clear, at least to me, that Luke is somehow based on Matthew, but that's not really the point of what we're doing. I just thought it was a neat little tangent in time to mention that connection. The next story we'll tell what, we'll come back. We'll let's go read Zacchaeus, and then we'll come back over here. So Zacchaeus, first story, very simple. You can do 2 things with it. You can just go through and read it. It doesn't take long. Or you can think about the connections each time as you go through it. Maybe you'll want to pause me and just do a simple read, and then I'll do it with the connection. So pause me, just read just the actual words in the Bible, and then come back here. All right, I'll read it with you too. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. So we just finished the Bartimaeus story as he was entering. So now he's in Jericho, and he was passing through. By the way, that passing through reminds me of like when they were in the boat and Jesus was passing by, or whenever on the road to Emmaus, Jesus acted like he was going further. Like Jesus could go and pursue the will of God without you, but you can choose to be a part of it if you want. But we see that a lot in the gospel about how the plan is going to move forwards, and you get a choice to be a part of it or not. And so a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Oh, of course he was wealthy if he was chief tax collector. But the wealthy is a word which connects us to a story in 18. There was a man who was wealthy, a wealthy young ruler according to Luke, a young man according to Matthew. But that young man, that's the box here, he was very sad when he was told to sell all he had and follow Jesus, right? And Jesus famously said, "How hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. Indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." And so Zacchaeus is being contrasted with this story because this guy went away sad. Zacchaeus is going to do it, right? So he is going to go through the eye of a needle, which is just kind of a fun thing. So clearly a culmination of that story that we're about to see here. Verse 3. He wanted to see Jesus, but because he was short, you can see how the he could mean Jesus or it could mean Zacchaeus. We almost always interpret it as Zacchaeus. Because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead. How did Luke know he ran, like versus walked? Was anybody even watching Zacchaeus at the time? But he ran ahead. Only children ran in this time period. Men didn't run, right? So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree, right? So anyone who runs and climbs is a childlike nature to them, right? And so he wanted to see him, hear him, that kind of thing, since Jesus was coming that way. This connects also to 18. Truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it. So here we have the physical example of the little child who is going to enter the kingdom. Verse 5. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Must, he uses words like this over in John, like Jesus had to go through Samaria, right? I mean, he didn't have to go through Samaria and meet the woman at the well, but in a way, he also did have to because this is what he came to do, right? I must stay at your house today. We get an introduction of the word house here. House connects to temple. I think all the way back to David is like, I will build a house for you, talking about temples and houses. So we get this idea of houses, which is going to come up again later in chapter 19 as he clears the temple. And Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed him gladly. So he chooses to welcome Jesus. And so this line points forwards to the rest of the chapter. But all the people saw this and they began to mutter. Mutter is used exactly twice. They muttered, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. The other time mutter was used was also in the journey. It was in Luke 15. The tax collectors, hey, what do you know, tax collectors are back. Tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around, and they were gathering around to hear Jesus. So to hear Jesus, to see Jesus, kind of represents this, you understand and recognize who Jesus is, right? So they were going to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they muttered. And the thing they muttered is, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So it's just kind of funny to see these parallels of earlier things in Luke, but people that aren't listening and seeing. But Jesus stood up and said, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. The rich man back here said to sell everything, but apparently half is good enough. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay it back 4 times the amount. 4 times the amount, commentators say this, I'm just quoting them, was commonly the highest penalty you could get for like out and out stealing from somebody. And so Zacchaeus is humbling himself to pay back anything at 4 times the amount. Like consider it robbed, right? And so Jesus says to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. Very simple sentence, and Luke makes it fluid, right? But if you break this down, it breaks down so interesting. Today, very common word used in Luke for things happening today. Same with the word journey, he uses a lot. Salvation. So this is the Greek word for salvation, but remember that the name Jesus is Yeshua, and Yeshua is a Hebrew word, and that Hebrew word Yeshua means salvation, right? So today, Jesus has come to this house, right? So Jesus has come to the temple. Because this man too, so salvation has come to this man, and he's a son of Abraham. This phrase, son of Abraham, was used exactly one other time. It was used near the beginning of the journey with the woman who was subject to bleeding for 18 years. So she was called a daughter of Abraham. Only 2 times it's used. And so a tax collector is somebody that they would have shunned, excluded, right? They would not have been part of the family. They were hoping that the Messiah would come and kill people like that, right? That was their goal. Same with a woman who is subject to bleeding. She must have done something to deserve it, and they would have excluded her. And God is, Jesus in this case, is very much including Zacchaeus, is very much including this woman from chapter 13. And so it's just kind of continuing that theme from the journey. And then the big finish, you see this a lot in Jesus' teachings. He kind of finishes with a clinching, pithy last statement. Very common for teachers to do this. It's something you can remember, right? It's like the take-home message of a story. For the Son of Man, Jesus' favorite title for himself, came to seek and to save the lost. You can go read this 3 times in chapter 15. To seek and to save the lost. We had the lost sheep, seek and to save the lost coin, the woman searching her house, and then the prodigal son to seek and to save the lost. And so Jesus not only tells parables, but Jesus literally does these things. And so lost Zacchaeus is being saved here. That's why Jesus must come and stay there. So I kind of beat a dead horse there in showing these connections, but I just think it's really impressive of Luke. What a masterful artist of sewing together these stories, concluding the journey, in something that's so simple we call it a child's tale, and not just concluding this one, but pivoting to talk about welcoming and the house, which is what the rest of the chapter is going to be about. I just really, really enjoyed it a lot. All right, next story up, Parable of the 10 Minas. I think for this one, instead of me reading it, I'm just going to let you read it, and I'll kind of highlight a couple of things in it. So I recommend you pause me, you just go through and you read it, and then I'll just highlight a couple things in it. All right, so you either did or you didn't, and you're probably not going to change. But this story comes from a background that relates to Archelaus. Let me go to the other slide deck here. So a little background for people that don't have the Jewish history on the top of their heads. King Herod was the king for many years. I forgot when he started, around BC 46 all the way up to BC 4. Very paranoid guy. I think I got the start date wrong, but that's okay. Very paranoid guy. Killed numerous of his sons, killed at least one wife because he was worried that they were going to take over his kingdom, right? Was in fact killed by one of his sons, poisoned. So very paranoid guy, very hated. He's the one who killed all the boys in Bethlehem, right? So that was Herod the Great. He died in 4 BC. He had 3 sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. There were 2 Philips. It was the second of the 2 Philips. And the Archelaus was going to reign in Idumea, which we won't get into. John Hyrcanus conquered Idumea and basically kind of made it part of Judea. But he was going to rule that area and Jerusalem and the Judean countryside area. And he wanted to be king, just like Herod was king. King is an honorary title that's bestowed upon you by Rome. In 4 BC, he went to Rome to have himself anointed king of the area. He was not given that title, probably because the rest of the Jewish nation sent a delegation to say, hey, don't make him, we don't want him ruling over us. He was made ethnarch, I believe, or something like that. I forget what his title was. And it was kind of a trial period, right? He ruled for 10 years, from 4 BC up to 6 BC. During this 10-year window is when Jesus' family would have returned from Egypt. They returned and they found Archelaus reigning in this area. And so they didn't come back to Bethlehem. They actually went back to Nazareth. You could read Matthew chapters 1 and 2 to kind of learn all about that. But Archelaus in 6 AD went back to Rome to have himself appointed king. But the Jewish nation, they sent 50 delegates behind him and said, no chance, don't do it. Rome sided with the Jewish delegates. They completely deposed Archelaus. He was not made king. Instead, they instituted the governors to rule over Judea. Pontius Pilate was the third, I think, of the governors to rule over. But at any rate, I tell this very long background because this parable that hopefully you just read is directly based on this idea of going off to Rome to have yourself made king and then to come back. The difference is that the king here is Jesus, right, as opposed to Archelaus, and Jesus is made king, whereas Archelaus was not. But it's interesting that Jesus tells this story in Jericho, because Jericho was one of the biggest palaces. King Herod built many palaces throughout the area. He could live in each one for a few months. The Winter Palace was in Jericho. And you always wonder, did he tell this parable standing in front of the Winter Palace in Jericho, where Archelaus had ruled a lot of times and 30 years ago had gone off to be made king? At any rate, I just think it's neat how our Bible comes out of a context, and we clearly see the inspiration for this parable Jesus gave coming from Archelaus, but with twist, right? So just kind of summarizing it for you here. Went off to be appointed king, gave 10 servants 10 minas, presumably each servant got one, right? With simple instructions. Put this money to work, right? That's all you got to do. 5 words. Put it to work. And then there was this delegation that went after him. So there's two groups. There's the delegation group, and then there's the 10 that got minas, right? Or you could think of it as it's a parable, so it works at many levels. You could think about it as the gifts and resources you've been given, the opportunities you've been given, what you're going to do with the mina that the king gave you, right? And so one turned it into 10 more. 10's a number that kind of represents God, so he did really well, like followed God's will, got a tremendous return on his one mina, and then he was trustworthy in a small manner. He was taking charge of 10 cities in the kingdom of God, right? One did 5, take charge of 5 cities. By the way, people always talk about this as like treasures in heaven or rewards in heaven. I don't know. I don't read that as a reward. I read that as a responsibility, right? Which is welcome. But people, and it makes perfect sense, people who have been successful with their mina here, they're going to be the ones that the king chooses to give responsibilities in the kingdom to come, right? So not surprise. Comes to the third of the servants. It's funny, we only talked to 3 of them. We don't talk to the other 7, and he didn't do squat with it. Now he didn't lose it. That was good. But the instructions were simple: put it to work, right? He didn't do anything, right? He didn't even like put it on deposit. And so his money was taken from him, and it was given to the one who had 10, with the message being, everyone who has more will be given. But for the one who has nothing, by the way, they have nothing, and then what they have, which I thought was nothing, but even that nothing will be taken away. So the point of this parable, if you look at the start, it's people thought the kingdom of God was coming. So effectively they thought, Jesus is stepping into his kingdom, the same way we think about the second coming of Jesus. And Jesus' parable is kind of meant to humble them a little bit, right? Push them back a little bit. Like, are you sure that you are ready for the second coming, which they thought would be the first coming? They thought it was all one coming, right? Are you ready for that, right? So what have you been doing with your mina, right? And so really neat parable, really thoughtful. It's one of the few times that Jesus really sounds like his brother James of like, faith without works is dead. But the idea is that you're doing something with what you've got. Lots of good reflections from our group on this, like an opportunity to study at college, whereas other people wouldn't have a chance like that. What are you doing with it, right? So it's just kind of a neat story. Next story. Next story is very famous. The next story is the triumphal entry. So Jesus rides the donkey from Bethphage all the way into Jerusalem. This story has a lot of history to it. Let's go to, maybe I'll go to Bible Gateway here. It goes back to 1 Kings. It's probably before 1 Kings, but we'll start here. 1 Kings has a story about Solomon. So David had many sons. This is 1000 BC. They all wanted to be king. Stories of Absalom killing Amnon. We're not going to get into all that. The oldest was Adonijah at the time. Adonijah was just going to make himself king. So Adonijah sets himself up as king. But David chooses differently. He's, some people say, tricked by Nathan and Bathsheba's ruse to anoint Solomon. But David picks Solomon, right? So, and then he wants to show that this is who he's picked as king. And so he gives these orders. He tells Nathan and Zadok, the priest, the high priest at the time was Zadok. Nathan was just a prophet. And his war general as well, right? So the priest, the prophet, and the war general. And so he says, take my son Solomon, and what I want you to do, so everybody knows that I picked him as king, mount him on my mule, right? And then go down to the spring of Gihon. This is from Bethphage down into Jerusalem, right? So this is the same route. And so they did this. So it says that, it's so funny, the Old Testament, it's like they gave him these instructions, and then they say, amen, may it be as you've said. And then they do it, right? And so they mount Solomon on King David's mule and they escort him to Gihon. The high priest anoints him with the sacred oil as the king. So, I mean, that's what they should have done for Jesus, right? The high priest himself, Caiaphas, should have anointed him with oil, right? And said, "Long live King Jesus," right? That's, of course, not what happens. So that is 1000 BC. Move forwards 500 years, and we see a prophecy. This is from Zechariah 9:9. We could show you the whole chapter if we wanted, but it says a prophecy, the word of the Lord. And there's a lot of details, but I'm going to focus just on 9:9. And so this prophecy, Jesus read this as well. And it says, "Greatly rejoice, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Zion. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious." So in a right relationship, victorious, but lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The question of one animal or two animals is I don't know if I want to say borderline funny or just straight up funny. But Zechariah made this a little ambiguous, just to be perfectly honest. And that ambiguity is in his writing. And so you can see it in Hebrew and you can try to figure it out in Hebrew. But it talks about seated on a donkey. So let's see here. Where's it going? Rejoice coming. Just you have to read it from right to left. Endowed with salvation, humble, and he is mounted on a donkey, on a hamor. So this is the common word for donkey. And then it says, and vav, on, so and on, or even on, a colt, an ayir, which is a young animal. The ben, so ben just means son, of a, and then here's a weird word for donkey, an aton. And so this is she donkey, it turns out, but it's just kind of a weird word for it. And so then the question is, what are we talking about? Are we talking about one animal, a donkey, or are we talking about two animals, the donkey and this colt of a donkey? So either way, both donkeys, right? I think that it's referring to one animal, by the way. The vav here, there's only so many Hebrew connecting words, but it's saying a donkey, and not just any old donkey, a young donkey. It's also interesting to see the Septuagint's translation of it. This one reads left to right, and you can see it's described in a slightly different way. It's a pelon. I can never remember which words are which in this. I don't speak Greek, right? But you can, if you know how to use tools well, mounted on a new donkey and a new horse. And so this word that the Septuagint use, oops, that's the wrong word. Pelon or something like that is the same word that they write in Greek. At any rate, they get translated by all four Gospels. Matthew is the only one who literally makes it ambiguous when there's one or two animals. Everybody else just says it was a donkey, right, and moves on with life. All right, I don't know how I got on that tangent. At any rate, Luke is the only one who realizes that it's a donkey that has never been ridden before. That might come from the fact that the Septuagint suggests the young donkey, and Luke reads the Septuagint very well, being a native Greek speaker. And he emphasizes that nobody's ever ridden on it, which stresses the animal's significance in ceremony, right? So which is kind of neat. Sorry about getting on such a tangent there. I'm sure you got bored. But you got to see how tools are used to really do this research, which is neat. Luke is the only one, and by the way, you can go through and you can read it, but really this is a prophetic sign act, kind of like Ezekiel would lay on his side and eat Ezekiel bread over a fire. Isaiah would walk around naked. This is a sign act to show you that I am the king, right? So I am Lord of heaven and earth. Very bold move. It would have definitely concerned a lot of people, and Luke captures that. So he captures it in that some of the Pharisees of the crowd, I put that break wrong, some of the Pharisees tell him to be quiet, And this was our verse of the day. And he says, you don't know what would bring you peace. So their strategy is to have people keep quiet. Jesus says, no, that's not what's going to do it. All right, keep cruising. Next, and by the way, you can read that in all 4 gospel accounts. That is so fun. You can just click on these links and you can see little differences that each author put on things, whether they quote Zechariah 9:9 or not. Matthew is the only one in which it kind of says 2 animals. Really, Matthew just preserved the ambiguity. Other little things, just to kind of mention them. Mark's is really fun. So Mark talks about, let's see here, untie it and bring it here. Oh, he actually mentions nobody's ever written it in Mark 2. And so Mark mentions that it was in the street. And by the way, it was tied at a doorway. And as they untied it, the people standing there asked them questions. And these details are not accidental, right? These details are Mark's writing style. Mark captured the words of Peter. It seems very obvious, or very compelling to me, I would say, to think that Peter was one of these 2, right? And so he's got all these little details that nobody else has, which is kind of fun. In fact, John is, of course, the Vista. He just says Jesus found a young donkey. He doesn't even go into the details of Peter at all, right? Which I think is just funny. Jesus found the donkey. Cool. And so very enjoyable thing. Oh, by the way, what we did as a group, I thought was pretty fun. I'm sure maybe they liked it too, is we did a activity for how to be a Bible nerd. So I printed up this handout. This handout is 20 pages long, so quite lengthy handout, and cut it up. And this handout is every single story from Bartimaeus to even beyond chapter 20. There's the story of the widow who put in 2 small copper coins, the story of the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's just before and just after. And what we did is we cut out every single one of these stories. And so there's quite a few in Matthew, quite a few in Mark, quite a few in Luke, less in John, but we cut out the ones from John that fit. And we set them side by side on a table. So there were 2 groups that kind of set it up, plus some of their Old Testament references. And we read not just down columns for each gospel, but also across columns, right? So there's a lot of books that do this. But man, there is no substitute for a bunch of paper. So when I was preparing for the Bible study, I did this on my pool table. So this is still what my pool table looks like right now. And I read them down each one. And then I read the stories across each one. And it lets you see the little differences between authors. And it's just so fun just to take time and do that. I won't tell you everything that I discovered because it's more fun if you do it yourself, right? Some of the interesting things that we noticed from the temple. The first one is that John's version of the clearing the temple is from 2 years earlier, right? So there's 3 Passovers in John, very distinct, which represent 3 years of Jesus' ministry. And the clearing of the temple happened 2 years earlier, right? And then the question is, what's the historicity? Did Jesus do it twice? Did somebody displace the story and put it here when actually it happened at a different time? Everybody has their opinion, and you should read them and think about your opinion too. In my opinion, he did it twice, right? So he did it 2 years earlier when he was kind of an unknown, and then he did it after the triumphal entry. And then he came back the next day, and they had to deal with Jesus. He was not going anywhere. It's also interesting that if you read John's account, I think John had read Luke's account, and perhaps others as well, but he very much talks about what authority did you have to do this, right? And so it's just kind of funny how these stories go together. A lot of the same words got used in them, but it is a story that is 2 years earlier, right? And also in John, he talks about how you're going to destroy this temple and raise it in 3 days. And so who John was is he was the mystic, right? So he saw how the temple, which is the overlapping space of heaven and earth, or the sky and the land, like God's space and our space, that overlapping space is the temple. That overlapping space is Jesus himself. There's so many analogies to this overlapping space, like Eden is an overlapping space, the Promised Land, overlapping space. And then today, the church is the body of Jesus. The church is the overlapping space of God's space and human space. And wherever two are gathered together in my name, Jesus is in the middle. That's in Matthew. And I look forward to seeing that. But at any rate, John makes all these much deeper theological connections, whereas the others just kind of tell the story a little bit. But that's quite right. This is where we ran out of time in our small group, so I won't say a lot after this point, but I'll just say a couple things about each story. The authority of Jesus is questioned, and he responds saying, who was John, right? Because you can't really understand who I am unless you understand who John is. And if you won't accept who John was, well, you're not going to accept who I am, right? And so it's not just like getting off the hook. It's saying that if you want to understand me, you got to understand John. After that, we get a very good parable, the parable of the tenants or the 10 ants. And it's about a man planting a vineyard. In Matthew and Mark, he not only plants the vineyard, but he digs around it a wine press and puts in a watchtower. There is no missing the connection here. Israel is the vineyard. God has dug this vineyard, and he's looking for fruit, right? The servants who come are the prophets, I think Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, that type of thing. And each of them is disrespected and thrown out. And then God doesn't give up. He sends his son, right? pretty transparent parable here, right? And they throw him out and they kill him. And then the question is, what is the owner of the vineyard going to do to those tenants, you think? And so it's a very direct warning. It is not that veiled of a threat in some ways. And they respond and say, God forbid. Jesus doesn't back down. He was not one to play happy. He looked directly at them and he said, what then is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, right? And then that is a direct quote from Psalms, that part. And then Jesus paraphrases some things in the Old Testament and says, whoever falls on the stones will be broken to pieces, but anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. Think Daniel 2, where the rock not cut out by human hands crushes, right? And so Jesus directly quotes sometimes and also kind of makes his own synthesis of Old Testament scripture, which is fun. They realized it was spoken against them. So yeah, you think. But they couldn't really do anything about it because of the people. So, Jesus, he's got a following of who knows how many thousand people here. There were 5,000 people could fit on the temple courts. You can't just grab him, right? It just doesn't work. And so it's this weird little stalemate that they're in because of the mobs, right? So they, in the Synoptic Gospels, start in with word battles. And so they try to trick him. They're wanting him to say that they shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, so they have grounds to arrest him. Then they can say, hey, not us, we had to do it. So they want to know if they should pay taxes to Caesar because they're hoping he goofs up, right? They're hoping he trips up. Because if he says, yes, pay taxes, that'll make the mob kind of mad. And if he says no taxes, well, the guards are right here. We're going to arrest you, right? He says, show me a denarius. It's got a symbol on it, which violates the second of the 10 commandments, right? Make no graven images. And so they shouldn't even have the denarius. So pretty clever and kind of easy way out of this. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God's what is God's. By the way, they came here to try to trip him up, but he doesn't, of course. Kind of hard to trick out, just a tough thing to do. But they just lie about it later, by the way. And so later, when the assembly rose up, that's the Sanhedrin, they took him to Pilate. The very first thing they say, this is going to come in a couple chapters, we've found this man subverting our nation, Oh, and by the way, he opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar. I mean, like, it didn't even matter what Jesus said. You can see why he didn't bother speak later in the trial, because it didn't matter to them, right? And he didn't need to try to defend himself against people that are just going to lie about it anyway. The witty banter continues. The next up is the Sadducees, so kind of different groups with different angles. Sadducees believe only in Torah. So Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection, a bodily resurrection. Sadducees have joined the Greco-Roman world for their own profit and gain. The Roman world was largely Platonist. Platonists believe that at the moment you die, your spirit is free. Your spirit goes off to another spiritual realm, but there is no resurrection. There is no bodily resurrection. And so there's probably many arguments at the time that show how old-fashioned the idea of resurrection is, and make fun of it, right? You can totally imagine how that would go. And so they come to him with a conundrum that he couldn't possibly solve, of if you have multiple marriages, right? Like, who in the resurrection are you going to be married to? And they tell it very elaborately with 7 husbands, which we won't even get into that. And Jesus responds and says, they will be God's children. They won't be able to die. There won't be marriage or people being given in marriage. As a married man, I've got like a whole paragraph on this one. This concerns me about what I should expect. I will say that I don't quite know what to expect, but I certainly have trust in God and whatever it is. But I will say that if you read other passages, so for example, this is one from John I grabbed. Jesus is talking to Mary Magdalene, who just grabs his feet, and Jesus is like, yeah, you gotta let go, right? But he says, don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. I'm sure Mary heard this word too, but the word I hear there is the word yet, right? So the word yet means it's a promise for future, right? So even though it's not going to happen at present, it will happen in future. And so, the promise is that there will be, personal physical touch in the future. And so Mary can hold on to him later. So I don't know how that factors in to the ban on marriage and being given in marriage here. But I will say that I definitely think that he's referring more to the cultural custom and institution of marriage, this idea of continuing the family name through kind of forced arranged marriages. Like, that just won't be necessary because there's no reason to continue the family name. They're not even going to die, right? So at any rate, it's fun to see what Jesus is talking about and also try to understand it in a deeper but responsible way. Moving on. His next counter argument is Moses in the burning bush is described as, and we can go read this, it's kind of fun, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By the way, I always wondered if Jacob was going to be in the kingdom, but apparently yes. And he uses a present tense, which means that Jesus knew his Bible very well. He could look at grammatical tenses and see that they were living. He was the God of these people, not he used to be the God of those guys. And so he's just saying that they're still alive, right? And then the teachers of the law, not the Sadducees, notice, but the teachers of the law who believe in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, not just the Torah, they say, well said, teacher, right? By the way, this story, you may as well remember it. We're going to see it again in Acts. And so in Acts, Paul is going to be in front of the Sanhedrin and say, I'm on trial for my belief in the resurrection of the dead, right? And so that's what's going to divide the room and kind of how Paul gets out of that situation. I wonder, because it's not really that critical here, it was in Matthew and Mark, but Luke chose to include it here, which was consistent. I wonder if it was because of his later experience with Paul, because I think he wrote both of them later, but it definitely has a parallel in Acts, which is fun. Next little witty banner scripture kung fu comes from Jesus this time. David himself declares in the book of Psalms, the Biblio of Psalms, The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. People love this line, by the way. It's from Psalm 110. It's going to be quoted by Peter very famously in one of his first prayer sermons in Acts chapter 2. It's mentioned in Hebrews. It's quoted by Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. It's in Hebrews. But it shows evidence that the Messiah was always more than a man, right? So the Messiah predates David, right? And so how can he be his son? So they were expecting a Messiah to be a man, a military war general, to set up the kingdom in the way that they understood setting up a kingdom, right? But he's just pointing out that there's more going on here, right? Then the last little bit of 20, I realized that I've lost most of my audience a long time ago, was to beware these teachers of the law, right? And so that's not really a surprise at all, speaking against them, because the things they care about are not the things that God cares about. They care about honor and prestige and banquets. They devour widows' houses. These little words they could put in. The next story is about a widow, right? So it's like, hey, widow, widow. So just Luke's always making these connections. It must have taken forever to write this thing, right? These men will be punished most severely. Okay, good, happy finish. So at any rate, that is Luke 19 and 20. I went into much greater detail in this video than we did in our Bible study, but it's because I wanted to just kind of remember some of the things that we talked about. Thank you for joining. We'll see you next time when we start back on Luke chapter 21. We'll get into as far as the Last Supper next time. All right, we'll see you then.